Either way, though, we should mention Backlash gets quite the reception.
Yeah.
4.5 stars, a critical success. Meltzer would say, by taking a bump off the ramp through the tables and one on the tacks, Orton, as weird as this sounds, added toughness to his aura that needed to be added to be a money player. It's easily the best match of his career against Mick Foley. While regular usage of matches of this type are negative, because the WWE hasn't done this type of match in years, it was very effective. Foley, who said before the match he was expecting this match to be one of his career highlights, lived up to those standards, even though he has not done a singles match in more than 4 years. The key point of the match is, just like Foley did for Triple H on 2 straight pay-per-view shows in 2000, he had Orton beat him in a great match under Foley's rules. When it was over, Triple H gave the line that Orton is no longer the legend killer, but a legend himself. And in his first singles match in 4 years, Foley, motivated by the fear of failure, was his harshest critic. He said he set his mind to the idea that WrestleMania would be one of his best performances, but he felt he didn't deliver, saying in an Edmonton Sun interview that he couldn't maintain his intensity. Quote, I accepted that there probably is no such thing as real retirement from wrestling, end quote. He said if the match came up short, he'd have to recognize something was missing. Since the match did anything but come up short, he's indicated he's up for doing 1 or 2 matches per year. As things are scheduled, he'll be back probably in September, partially to promote the children's book he's doing with WWE called Tales from Rascal Lane. So let's talk about the beginning of that write-up, that Orton had sort of earned his stripes. Was that, I mean, how important was that from your standpoint in telling this story?
Really important. For me, if the guy I was working with wasn't better off after he worked with me, then it was, the matches weren't a complete success, no matter how good they were.
Right.
Especially if somebody was less valuable than they were, which I don't think was the case, but there were a couple, where I thought were, swings and misses, where guys were not necessarily better off. But by and large, I felt like that was the case, that almost everybody who worked with me felt like it had been beneficial to them. And in the case of Randy, it was so pronounced because we're going to take you to my post-match, the hours post-match, and then we can go revisit the match in a little bit. So I had driven. I had a red-eye flight out of Edmonton. I dropped all that weight, so I was going to reward myself with
272 is what Dave
272,
writes.
Yeah. With a couple of Tim Hortons donuts. But before I could go in and have the Tim Hortons donuts, I threw up in the parking lot, probably because I had a concussion. Probably from taking the back bump onto the ramp. I think as you get older, whether you see the knees were the first thing to go on boxers, maybe it's our neck strength. And I think maybe that's why some of the older guys are having problems with concussions on bumps that would seem to be normal bumps that they could have done in their prime without that type of fallout. So I throw up in the parking lot. I catch my flight. I fly to Toronto where my bags are lost, and I've got to wait for 4 hours. Now I get back. My son Huey's in the hospital for dehydration.
Wow.
When you're a little guy, that type of thing can happen. So I give my wife a break. I go to the hospital for 3 or 4 hours, spend a little time with the little fellow in there. I go back to watch Raw, no sleep at all. And Randy Orton might as well be a different human being because he is treated that way by the crowd in Calgary that night. And I thought, man, it dawned on me what we had done. Having the great match and that post-match glow, that's a great thing. But to see that it had done exactly what I hoped it would do, and then some, that was the really gratifying part. Within a couple weeks, Randy was being cheered. And they put his face turn into play, which I thought was way too early. But the fact that you had this guy that people weren't fully behind.
They weren't sold on him.
Sold on him. The respect wasn't there. And then to know that match played such a role, and to have Randy 16-time champion?
I think so.
Who still, as of a few years ago, thought of that match as the best one of his career. And probably you could go through and pick out a few dozen, that technically were better matches. But as far as doing something for a guy and allowing the fans to see him in a different way, I'd be hard-pressed to come up with anything I've ever done. And I'll put it out there, you know, for the larger wrestling world to have a discussion about a match. Maybe Flair making Sting at one of those original clashes. But I was really, really proud of what we had done in the ring, what we had done to build it in the storytelling arc. It was good for me to have that setback at Mania so I could climb that mountain and, you know, stake my claim up there.
When you look back at the way that match was put together, is that something you had in your head weeks in advance of here's the type of match I want to do?
Yeah, so I'm going to be completely honest with you guys, as I think that's important on this show. I love the idea of, let's call it the ring, you know, but those days are kind of behind us. There's only 3 matches I've been in that were planned from A to Z. One of them was with Triple H at the Royal Rumble. One of them was with Randy that night in Edmonton, and another one was when I showed up to do an FMW stadium show, and Wing Kenamura handed me like 8 sheets of notebook paper. And I looked at it and went, sounds good to me. I had 0 input in what was a very good hardcore wild match, you know, but it wasn't like, I do have an ego when it comes to these things. I love putting my imprint on something, but when someone has clearly worked as hard as he had to put together something that made me shine and put me over in the end,
let's go with
I was okay with that. Let's do it. So I made such a wise decision in that, as much as I kicked myself in the butt for doing the car show in Huntsville the night before I worked with Triple H at the Garden, I cancel an event in St. Louis the day before my match in Edmonton. So I fly into Edmonton the day before, which I urge any wrestler, please take care of yourself before your big match. And Randy comes up to the room. I've never had somebody, you know, this is Steamboat and Savage type stuff. And Randy, just that moment we had, you know, like we don't have to have an in-depth discussion about anything as long as we both live, you know. We have that moment, not only what we created in the ring, but that night before. And his eyes are he's just taking it in, absorbing it all. But even with everything we had planned, if we hadn't relayed that match to Michael Hayes, and then Michael Hayes looked at us and says, you're going to need more time. And he goes to talk to Vince, and 16 turns into 26. And that's what we needed to tell that story. Otherwise, we've been rushing through it. A few of the great moments to me in the match. First of all, there's this very creative break where I go to set Orton on fire, and Bischoff comes out, claims that he'll have the match will be stopped.
Yes.
And that gives me a very creative way to catch my breath. And then we also have the moment where after Randy has taken his RKO, it backfires. So instead of me being the guy who had a worse conversion rate with thumbtacks than Wile E. Coyote had with Acme products, and that I was always going to end up in the tacks that I brought into the ring.
Right.
Randy ends up taking that RKO and the tacks. And again, I say, like, Randy, very, very good wrestling, you know, the theatrics of it, but he's young at that time. You can't fake the shock that he was in. You know, his eyes were just wide open. I bring him up to the ramp, and I throw him off the ramp, which also gives me a little bit of time to rest up as that camera goes over and over. And Mike Chioda goes to check on Randy, and all Randy can say is, Chioda, those tacks were a bad idea. He's really feeling it. And now I come off that ring apron with what I think is the best elbow of my career, partially because it's captured with that low angle shot. Couldn't have dropped a better one in my life. Originally, I was going to drop it on him on a gurney, but those gurneys are built like, it's like that WWE table that won't give unless something is manipulated,
yeah.
Right? So I even sense there's no way I can drop this elbow on Randy on this steel gurney without my body just being jolted, and it's not going to look good anyway. Something's got to give. So that's where, the platform is it's just enough so that when he hits it, he goes through it. And now the elbow I drop is onto the debris. So I'm not going through a table. I'm not breaking anything with the elbow. I'm dropping it onto something that's already broken. And it's a beautiful elbow, which makes Randy kicking out of it
even bigger. When you first lay this match out to Michael Hayes, and we've got all of the props, if you will, does he feel like he has to run that up the flagpole, or is it okay because it's pay-per-view?
He does run it up the flagpole. Vince knows ahead of time that I want my toys. It's understood that I'm going to have my toys. He doesn't like the powder, hates the powder as a cutoff spot, but he grants it to us. There was one funny moment backstage where they want Randy to come out wearing a hockey helmet. And Randy says, I don't know, Michael, I feel a little funny. And Michael yells at him, he says, Vince wants to see that effing helmet. And Randy goes, okay. He goes, I'm just ribbing you, So he would have looked ridiculous coming out. And you could argue that Randy should have planned a better weapon, because Randy comes out with the smaller of the two barbed wire weapons. And in my head, it's that Crocodile Dundee.
That's not a knife.
This is a knife. So Randy goes to do his thing and has all the, the authenticity of a wire snake springing out of a salted peanut can, right? He goes, moing, and I knocked that thing out of his hand, and now we're off to the races with the 26 minutes of mayhem.
Was he nervous about taking the big bump into the thumbtacks?
Yeah, but he wanted to do it.
What's the advice that you would give him? Like, okay, is there a right way to take that?
Just 1,000 of them doesn't hurt that much worse than one or two in your hand.
Oh.
I believe he wanted to do it, just like Edge wanted to do it 2 years later. And the fact that he did it without a shirt and that it was such a phenomenal image, I wish I'd wet my hair down. It's about the only thing I can say I wish I'd done differently. But in pre-match preparation, I go to the well. I listen to Winter by Tori Amos, which is my go-to song. And when I come out of there, it's like I'm flying on a cloud, similar to the way I described the way I felt January 10th, 95, before that big barbed wire match. Smaller in stature, but big in my head with Terry Funk, 8 months before we do the King of the Deathmatch tournament. But I remember Stacy Keibler walking up to me and saying, is this going to be one of those bloody things? And I go, oh yeah. Like, I was so locked in, I was exactly where I should have been for WrestleMania. And I didn't get near there. And I realized I don't have another chance. Like, if this one comes up short, I'm likely not to go again, not to try it again. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't want you to give me a number, but was your WrestleMania payoff substantially more than your Backlash payoff?
Yes, partially because I argued after receiving it that it should have been more. And eventually it was.
Well, the Backlash match was certainly more creatively rewarding.
Yeah.
When you look back at that match, is that top 5 for you, do you think?
Yeah, it's number 1.
Really?
Backlash is number 1 for me.
And then where does the Mind Games match wind up? 2
or 3.
Okay.
Hunter and me at Rumble 2000 is either 2 or 3.
That's probably my favorite of the 3.
Yeah, that was really beautiful. But Mind Games is there 2 or 3.
Would Mind Games be higher if it had a different finish, do you think? It's like a DQ.
Well, you can't get much higher than 2 or 3. I think what made Backlash so special to me is that it was my redemption. Whether people felt like I needed to be redeemed or not, I felt like I did.
More than that, Mick, you helped make a guy. And I know you're not going to phrase it that way, but let's put into context where Randy Orton was before his program with you. And again, this is April. 5 months later, he's the champ.
Yeah.
I don't know that would have been possible without your feud.
He would have gotten there eventually. Eventually. It was definitely, man, I had a lot of people help me out along the way, right? So when I was inducted into the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, it was just a year after the WWE. I did not want to do the same type of promo. So in verse, I wrote my ABCs of wrestling, where from A to Z, I picked out somebody and I did it as a poem. And I think, when it got to talking about F was Frogman LeBlanc, who's enhancement talent in Dallas. Frogman LeBlanc, Nasty Ned, you're the reason I'm standing here today. I've never seen an elbow drop that worked in MMA. So I had no shortage of people willing to help me, sometimes to the detriment. Sometimes you're helping build somebody. He's going to become a competition to you, but you do it out of the goodness of your heart. And you sit down and you talk about issues, social issues, whatever. You're not going to be on the same page on a lot of that stuff. But nonetheless, when we want to help, that's the best part of ourselves coming out. The part that helps, and I just saw a great documentary on Motown. I just watched it last night or early this morning, about 4 a.m., and that was what Smokey Robinson was talking about, the fact that he actually wrote and produced a lot of the great hits that the artists of Motown had. So he is building competition by giving away some of his best songs. But you do it because it's in your heart to give. There are givers and takers in this world, right?
Yeah.
I'm a giver probably to a fault, but that is part of what made me who I was in wrestling. If I had been someone just looking to take, I don't think I could have done the things I did. But other people willingly gave to me.
You come back through the curtain. Are you on cloud nine?
Oh, yeah.
How about Randy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's really happy.
Is this one of those moments where, in sales, there's a joke that when a guy makes his first sale, they cut his tie or whatever. Is this sort of like that with some of the guys for Randy? Because at this point, he's not been in a feud like this or a match like this or had this experience. And I think we sometimes forget how young he was here. I mean, just to put this in context, he was at his prom about 3 years prior to this, and now he's here with you. That's crazy to think you've got that much life experience. His prom. Yeah, he's had a driver's license 5 years at this point. Yeah. And now here he is in a pretty big time spot. This has to feel like you've done something good and all the boys know it.
Yeah. And I think even the guys who may not have liked the promo when they saw it, whether they realize, I don't know if they sat down and thought to themselves, geez, I guess that did play itself out well. And by Randy showing some fear, acknowledging the obstacle in front of him, he has made himself far bigger than if he had never acknowledged the obstacle. And that's the story I wanted to tell. So Randy overcame. I mean, I was battling my own personal expectations and disappointments, but Randy he had helped create me into that mythological figure I needed to be to make him bigger when he beat me.
It was fantastic. I hope everybody goes out of their way to see it.